Just wanted to say hello. And we're really excited to talk to you all about how we work together on this mapping segregation project. And I will let Jackie start us off just to talk about the general project overview, and then each of us will sort of focus in turn on the aspects of the project that we sort of worked most closely on. So Jackie, take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Charmaine, and thanks everybody for the invitation. Again, my name is Jackie Serrato, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Southside Weekly. So this segregation project started off as a collaboration with WTTW, and it would consist of a package on the topic of segregation in Chicago. Chicago already has this reputation of being the most segregated city in the country. But in our research, we found that there are actually many US cities that are the same way. As some examples, Cleveland, Newark, Philadelphia, Houston are very segregated cities. And there are others, but maybe these cities are not as large or as old as Chicago, and they haven't built that reputation. But because of that reason, you know, how segregation is associated with Chicago, there was a big responsibility on our part to show how we got to this point. WTTW would focus on what they do best, which is documentary work, and they also hosted community-based panels and other multimedia components. Our role at Southside Weekly was to provide the historical context and have our data experts, Charmaine and Pat, who are former and current Southside Weekly contributors, respectively, build out a map that would be a tool to help us understand this very complex phenomenon that is racial segregation. Charmaine, do you want to take it from there? Or Pat?
Yeah, sure. I can go over the project goals really quickly. So Jackie talked a little bit about this already, but we wanted to make sure that when readers looked at either a single story, say the mapping segregation story specifically, or the whole package, we wanted to make sure that they had enough historical context to then explore the data, which we provided in an interactive map, which Pat will talk about in a couple seconds. But in our initial discussions, we had to think through, what factors do we want to include, because there are many, and we had to think about how to scope the project and sort of limit ourselves to 3 or 4 factors, or you could think of them as like data layers to this mapping project. We wanted to make sure that it was user-friendly, because maps and data can be really overwhelming, especially if you're talking about a subject as like painful and I guess nuanced as racial segregation. You want to do it justice, but you also don't want to overwhelm your reader. So that was a sort of like design challenge that we had to work through, which I will talk about in a second as well. So we decided to focus on public housing, where was that built, and who lived in the areas that were like around public housing, where were highways constructed, and consequently, like whose homes were bulldozed in order to make room for those highways, where have schools closed down recently, and who did those school closures affect? So those were, I think, some of the main data layers that we are working through. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about design. So I mentioned that we had a lot of data to work through, and it's not just that we wanted to account for these like major factors like schools and public housing and highways. We also wanted to look at how the population was changing over time. And I think we were looking at 80 years of data. So we had a lot of data. And that is usually a good problem to have. But when it comes to translating that data into a coherent story that is easy for folks to understand without having spent hours looking at it themselves. So our goal was to have something that allowed the reader to, yes, explore the data if that's something that they're interested in, but also just if they were reading the story, we wanted to make sure that they could interpret the data with, like helpful historical context and understand how that data changed over time. So our solution was twofold. We knew for sure that we wanted an interactive map because there's so much to see. And we wanted to have static maps interspersed throughout the narrative to help readers, as they walked through the text, walk through the copy, they could understand like, oh, okay, so in, this particular decade, this is when a lot of highways were built. Let's look at things like in this particular decade. And let's look at like what the population looked like then, what were like the demographics and the density, and how did it change when we focus on the next layer, which was, I think, public housing. So that was our solution, just in terms of if folks are interested in like design thinking, there was a lot of that on sort of the front end. And the next slide, I wanted to just mention like why dots, because I think in a lot of maps that you see of Chicago, you'll see that a lot of them are choropleth maps, which for folks who aren't sort of familiar with mapping terms, it just means that you have a geographic or spatial unit, say like a census tract or a zip code, and you color that entire unit, one color usually. It's not like a gradient. So we could have done that with census tracts because we had census tract level data. But that runs into some sort of like visual spatial lies that you can accidentally tell with maps. And by that, I just mean that there are some census tracts that are larger than others. And basically, if you like color one, you could run into the issue of like drawing a reader's eyes to that census tract without like meaning to, especially if, say, like the population is not as dense there. So anyway, there are some issues with choropleth maps, which I'm happy to talk about sort of later in the Q&A if folks are nerding out and have questions. Another alternative that we could have that we looked at was like, say, a proportional dot map where you have one dot per census tract. So you're not coloring in a unit, you have like a dot, and the dot size changes depending on like density. But those two alternatives didn't really solve the problem that we were trying to solve, which was, we want to show both the demographic variation in a census tract and, throughout Chicago. And also we wanted to show the density and like how that was changing over time. And both the choropleth and the proportional dot map like just weren't good enough solutions for that particular problem. So we went with a dot density map, and I think it worked pretty well, but I worked on this project, so I might be a little bit biased. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Pat, who will talk a little bit more about the data underneath the interactive and static maps, and also just like the infrastructure that helped us set up the whole project.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Charmaine. So yeah, kind of like Charmaine said, I think one of the big focuses was to really give more context to a lot of things, because I'm sure folks have heard before that there's only one map of Chicago. And in most cases, that's true, but that one map has not been the same since 1930, which is as far back as we go here. So I've got census data here. I'm sure most folks are aware that pretty much the only place we could get this level data going back as far as we did is the census. And I specifically wanted to give a shout out to the, I think I'm going to get this right, Integrated Public Use Microdata Series to the National Historic GIS at the University of Minnesota. if anybody isn't familiar and you need census data going back more than a couple decades, it's free, it's great. They do incredible work. We literally could not have done this without the stuff that they provide. So kind of with that said, when we started out, like we knew that we could get historical census data in a digital format we could work with, at least going back pretty far. And like I said, 1930 is it's pretty far back for what we were looking at. And I think on top of that, we knew we needed to have it at a relatively like low level of detail, because for the dot density map that we're doing, each dot is randomly placed in an area. So that works if it's pretty small, but if it's a big area, then like the bigger the area, the more meaningless the dot is, and the more it's just kind of random noise. So we use tracks because it is the smallest unit that's also most consistent over time. In more recent years, we could have used like blocks or block groups, but just for the sake of consistency and just making things a little easier for us, we went with census tracks here. And so the years is also where things kind of got interesting. We really pulled back as far as we could. The only reason we didn't go further on top of kind of probably would have been overkill is that they didn't actually have digitized boundaries beforehand. Like the data just started to fall off because everything kind of originally from them is manually digitized. They don't have things going back like necessarily to the 1800s. And then another thing that you'll probably notice, I just have a GIF here of kind of all the layers enabled showing the map over time, and the colors definitely shift. Tricky thing about the census and just United States of America is that a lot of conflicting conversations about race. The census tracks race pretty differently in a lot of places over time, and not always in a linear way. When you're looking at 1930, it was really just white, non-white, and Black populations. So that was kind of, that's why you only see like fewer categories early on, but then it shifts. You get the separate addition of Hispanic as ethnicity, separate from race, which is a whole other thing later on. And I think it's the 1980 census. You have like a huge breakdown of like very specific ethnic groups that's then consolidated back into Asian and other censuses. So I'll just say there's a lot of different stuff going on. So we knew that kind of really the best we could do here is track what they gave us. So in a lot of cases, like the dots probably might not correspond to someone's actual identity. So we tried to identify that where we could and kind of make it relatively clear. But I think at least kind of from the start with what we have, it's about as much detail as we can give. And I think the big thing we really wanted to show here is being able to look at those shifts over time. By having this much data, we can kind of break out of the kind of recency of like one Chicago map and really look at like how that formed. And a lot of things that like, I think in particular, the West Side looks very different around like 1970. And that's not just kind of on like the flattening of categories. And so then I also had kind of some of these other layers. So like Charmaine said, we wanted to have other layers of data on top of things to provide additional context. And we had 4 of them. The one I'm actually not showing here, partially because it's a little tricky, is redlining. And what's interesting about that is we really wanted to include it from the beginning. It comes up a lot as a conversation. And it actually doesn't line up very well in Chicago. That's not to say redlining wasn't hugely influential, that it had a lot of consequences down the line. But I think in this case in Chicago, it just doesn't really cleanly map on to kind of current or even some of the demographics at the time. Like you'll see the loop was fully redlined kind of when the maps were originally released. So we did keep it in for context, but in general, I didn't include it in kind of the animation here because it really didn't line up. Some of the stuff that really did line up were highways. You look at kind of where a lot of the highways were made and the time that they were made, you look going south, and it's really a dividing line between white and Black communities. That's that in a lot of ways still stands today. And then kind of you see other ones either cutting through communities or kind of serving as a boundary in different spots. And then public housing is probably the one that, at least for me, stuck out the most. I think there's a lot of talk of segregation being a de facto thing. It's just where people happen to live. But I think public housing here is probably the clearest case, and a government-sponsored case where it was intentionally put in areas where there were already like very dense Black populations for the most part, and then kind of served to constrain that in the future. So rather than using it as a tool of desegregation or just spreading it out throughout the city regardless, it's pretty much consistently put into already densely populated areas of largely Black communities. And you can also see that influence with Cabrini Green on the near north side. You can kind of see like the Black population expand and then contract really significantly once Cabrini Green was demolished. So I think in general, public housing is probably one of the clearest areas you can see in the map. But then you see school closures, kind of the wave of school closures under Rahm Emanuel and how disproportionately those were in communities of color, specifically Black communities. And I think it really just, when you put all of those together, it presents a lot more of a, not quite a neat narrative, but a lot more context than I think you can get from any one of them isolated in time. And so this is kind of this is definitely more niche for the folks that are interested. So feel free to tune out for a second if you aren't. But one of the things we really needed to do for this was, because we're partnering with WTTW and we wanted it in multiple articles, we couldn't necessarily just put it in a single article. So we've got a kind of a responsive embed setup where you can just kind of take a tag, plop it into whatever article you want. It'll resize and look like it's part of it. And we're doing that with PIM.js. So shout out to NPR for putting that together. And another thing is that because we don't have a huge budget, we wanted to make sure that it was cheap. So everything is built out to static files. Like there's no maintenance that needs to be done. The files are just built once, they're there. We don't have to touch them again, and it'll just stay up as long as the browser can load it. Then on top of that, the only way that we were really able to do this level of detail with these dots is something called vector tiles. So whenever you load a map, you're really loading a bunch of separate squares that kind of form an image. That way you don't have to load the whole thing at once. You can kind of scroll around and load different chunks as you go. There's raster tiles, which are just images, and then vector tiles, which are really making up shapes that can include other details. The vector tiles are what we're using here. And so that's kind of how you can see each individual dot, hover over stuff, get more detail. And it's also how, so we have a little like approximately equal, like a squiggly equal sign on the legend. It's doing a lot of work because depending on the zoom level, it is not accurate. There's definitely some conversations about how we phrase that. Because you can kind of see in this image, like the amount of dots gradually goes up as you zoom in. That's because at those really low, like zoomed out levels, you can't actually distinguish like fine details and how many dots there are. So kind of rendering more is just going to make it slower to load and really be details that aren't relevant for people. So at that highest, like when you're closest zoomed in is when it really is like one dot per about 100 people. But in general, it was really kind of just a way of making this like loadable in the first place at some of these lower zooms so that you can still get the sense of kind of the whole city as well as really zoomed in levels, like getting a lot more fine-grained detail. And then at the bottom, this is all open source. We've got a couple different projects on the Southside Weekly GitHub, so feel free to take a look. And yeah, that's all kind of available if people want to look into it. And with that, yeah, I think we can just hand it over to questions. I've got another link to it right there.
I do want to say something about redlining, just in case there are people here who don't quite understand what that is, right? So redlining was part of a color-coded classification system that was implemented by the Federal Housing Administration across the country. And it determined the value of housing in a specific neighborhood based on the racial demographics of that neighborhood. So I understand that close to a third of Chicago neighborhoods were given a D grade. So each grade had a different color. The D grade meant that a community was redlined. It was marked red on the map. And these were predominantly Black communities that were deemed undesirable. and residents from these neighborhoods were denied bank loans and insurance, and it really limited their housing mobility. So I do think that there's a certain point where it's very helpful to see how different neighborhoods were graded, because after the restrictive covenants were outlawed in 1948, you could see Black residents begin to spread out of the Black Belt, and they start to move into more middle class and better resource communities that at the time were yellow lined. They were grade C, which was, you know, a grade above red line neighborhoods. And these were typically European immigrant neighborhoods on the west and the southeast sides. So if you kind of toggle the timeline by decade, you can see that after a certain year, Black residents have more mobility, and they start to move out of red line neighborhoods into yellow line neighborhoods and just better graded neighborhoods. Eventually, the system was eliminated, but it really, I think, restricted where Black residents were allowed to settle and move and build a life. And I think there were definitely other components that contributed to segregation, but they were difficult to map. Like I just mentioned, racially restrictive covenants. And these were basically stipulations that were written into the deeds of a property. Whenever a house was sold, it could be written into the deeds that this house cannot be sold to Black residents or to non-whites, basically. So that very much restricted Black residents and certain immigrants from moving into certain areas of the city. So even though at first we wanted to be able to represent restrictive covenants in the map, this was one of several other elements that we just didn't have the data for, or clean data. And I don't know, maybe Charmaine or Pat, you want to speak to that, how there were other layers that we wanted to add, but we just couldn't find the data that we needed to make it work. I think you all know a little bit more about that than I do. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say for now.
No, thanks for the additional context. I definitely skimmed over that. Charmaine, I know we talked about a couple other layers. Can you think of any offhand?
There was the indigenous boundary line from the 1800s. But I'm trying to remember why we decided not to include it, but I think it was largely in part because the data kind of like the population, the dot density data that we needed just wasn't available around that time. So we had to sort of table that layer. I want to say there were more housing related ones, but I can't think of them at the moment. Maybe if I pull up the email chain, I'll be able to find it.
I think subprime mortgages was another one, which were like, really low quality bank transactions that, we couldn't find the data for. I don't know if you have more context, Pat.
No, I think that was another one where like, even if it existed, it was hard for us to because that is spread out into other points. And so we'd essentially be like adding layers on top of layers that were maybe also dots or something else. So for some of those, like it existed more recently, but we couldn't find a good way of making it understandable. And so I think that was, we had a couple other things like that. I think contract buying was the big one now, although I'm pretty sure there is a project going on to track this exactly. So definitely some stuff being done there, but for our timeline just wasn't doable.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jackie and Charmaine and Pat. We'll now open up to questions here. So our first question from the audience was, I guess, kind of related to what you all were just talking about at the end here. Was there something in the data that really surprised you?
I think Pat talked about this briefly, but just wanted to underscore that I was surprised to see that, at least based on the data that we had, that the redlining layer didn't match up super cleanly with how segregation manifested, during that time and sort of in the decades after. So, I think like it's good to have the way that I try to approach data in journalism is it's good to have theories and hypotheses, and you want to like check your work as much as possible, because sometimes you get a result that you weren't expecting and you're just kind of like, I'm not so sure about this. And that's an okay thing to feel. But you do your best to check your work, you consult with other people and be like, hey, does this seem right? The way that I analyzed or set up this data visualization. So yeah, that surprised me. But I think in a good way, because I think racial segregation is like very nuanced and it deserves like a nuanced story.
Absolutely.
If I can add to that, because one thing that I found surprising just was how much the expressways were utilized to literally cement segregation, particularly the Dan Ryan Expressway, which we talk about in the text that accompanies this map. So this expressway was originally meant to run through Bridgeport, which was Mayor Daley's neighborhood, right? A predominantly white neighborhood. But because he was the mayor, he decided to move the development of this expressway. I think it was 8 blocks to the east of Bridgeport. So basically, they built an expressway between his neighborhood, Bridgeport, and the Black Belt. So the Black Belt, which is where Black residents were concentrated for many decades, was east of State Street. And then the expressway was built west of State Street. So you effectively had the majority of the white population living west of State, west of this expressway, right? And not only did it have an effect on segregation against the Black community, but also against the Mexican community, because further north on the northern end of the Dan Ryan Expressway, they basically razed, demolished like hundreds of houses that belonged to Mexican, Black, Italian, Greek, and Jewish residents. This expressway also led to the development of the the UIC Circle campus. And a lot of working class people, especially Mexicans, were pushed to Pilsen through these actions. So I was just shocked by just the massive effect that building one expressway could have in a city. And even though there were these, racist attitudes that already kept communities divided, this was like one way to like really build a physical barrier between communities. So I found that surprising.
No, that's definitely interesting. I know as a Chicagoan, I know just the impact of how that in particular, that expressway displaced people, especially like around where I guess like the division blue line is, that sort of area got changed a lot because of that expressway. On to the next question. So is there anything you would do differently if you had to do the project again? If you had the chance to do the project again?
I have one idea. And this is not from a data standpoint, really. But we had a pretty short timeline to get this done. I would say like maybe half a year or a little bit more than that. I think if we would have had more time, I would have liked to do more community engagement, talking to communities who were directly impacted by some of this construction and some of these like legislative and political decisions that were made across time. Because right now it's just a bunch of journalists and data people, looking at it kind of from the outside a little bit. I think if we had more time to work on this, we would have found ways to not just share this information with the communities that were directly affected, but also hear from them and just hear how they feel about it or how they grappled with some of these historical events.
Great, thank you. And I guess on that point of timelines, somebody actually had a question around timelines as well, maybe more from the technological perspective of timelines. So there's a question, did the project timeline affect the chosen technology in any way? And if so, how?
Were you gonna go, Charmaine? I saw you go off mute.
That was unintentional.
I mean, I think in this case, I would say probably not particularly. I think it was more the overall project constraints over the timeline. Because like making the map wasn't the majority of the time. I think it was a lot more time spent in conversations about like what it should be, researching layers for the CHA developments. And I think it was Jim Daly actually like manually did that, like got the addresses and like manually found out where they were and made sure to put them somewhere. So not all of this was very easy to get. So I think some of those conversations, trying things out, that was probably what took more time. But I think for a lot of other projects that have had like a small interactive, usually like a static build of to kind of like relatively simple stuff has typically been the way we'll go with some of this. So yeah, I'd say the majority of the time in terms of like the map was more really thinking through different ideas, researching and like kind of experimenting with some things.
Yeah, I agree. And for the static maps, a lot of that I just created in a tool called Mapshaper. So I used the data that Pat sort of transformed into the dot density maps. I pulled that data into Mapshaper, which is open source, really great, like simple spatial visualization tool. Downloaded the SVGs and then made them pretty. So that didn't take very much time. It really was, like Pat said, more about the design and the discussion that, where we did all of our like iterative work. That's what took the most time.
Kind of going along the lines of just, tools we use for data, are there things you think make specifically good tech or good data tools for journalism relative to other use cases? For example, what made the QIM.js especially useful?
I don't know if you had a specific response for PIM, Pat, but I have started to really like using PIM because then when I make, it basically allows you to like take your static build, your web page and just embed it sort of the way that you might with an iframe, but you don't have to worry about height in responsiveness, which is really tricky. And, obviously you want to think about that because while, we might be building and testing on like a desktop, or a laptop screen, most people will be looking at things on their phones and you want to make sure that like the user experience is good on a phone. So yeah, PIM just makes it really easy to embed stuff. It Yeah, and shout out to NPR for making that, because it's really nice. It's really simple. Like, I was alarmed when I read the documentation. I was like, really? That's the only thing you have to include in your JavaScript file? That's wild. So yes, would highly recommend if someone is interested in like responsive embeds.
Yeah, and I think it, like, for journalism, I guess it depends on what's meant, but really, for me, like for nonprofit journalism specifically, cheap or free is great. And I think that is probably like the biggest determining factor in all of this is like it's very cheap, and it loads relatively quickly. So I think more than anything else, those are probably the driving reasons behind things we did. How cheap can it be, and will it load quick for somebody?
Yeah, I think a more general response to like good tech tools for specifically nonprofit data journalism. Yes, like cheap and or free, but also like well documented. Usually what I find is that like in nonprofit data journalism spaces, you don't always have like a giant, like well-resourced team to go to if you have like questions about a particular stack. And so like, if you are the only person, or if you're like one of two people working on a project, like it's nice to be able to use something that like has really good documentation so you can work through and like debug stuff on your own. It just makes that a little bit easier. That's sort of what I found in my personal experience. Yeah, so we love documentation.
Great, thank you. So another question here. Did you look at segregation by community area? And if so, did you decide not to include community area because they were not predictive of segregation?
Well, I think it's my understanding that census tracts don't strictly follow neighborhood boundaries. So I think that's the reason, correct me if I'm wrong, Charmaine and Pat. I think that's the reason we decided not to look at it by neighborhood, just because it would be more difficult to map. And then we also decided not to add the names of the neighborhoods because it would be too crowded, right? Too distracting from the other components. But that's how I understand it.
Yeah, I think you could do sort of like a majority. I don't think census tracts map like 100% neatly into community areas, but I think you could do like a majority. You could make it work essentially, but a concern that I would have, and I don't know if this is founded or not, but is that like community areas could have changed over time. Like we're looking at almost 100 years worth of data, and like what we consider, or like what we call Lawndale, North Lawndale now, like might not have been called that. Like what people considered their neighborhood could have looked very different in the 1930s. And so just like thinking about that question, I'm not sure. I think those boundaries would have changed. And it sort of goes back to what Pat was saying when we talked about census tracts, is that like they're relatively stable over time. So even though they might not be super meaningful to anyone, like I personally don't know what my census tract is, but like this as a geographic unit, it stays mostly the same over time. And so it's just easier from a data analysis perspective to use that instead of community area. I don't know.
I think, yeah, the biggest reason for me is that it's less detailed. We'd really be losing information rather than gaining anything. Because my understanding is the whole point of community areas was to have like some finer level of detail. But that if you can get more detailed than that, it's definitely preferable. So census tracts, like I think someone has done like a mapping of like all of these census tracts go into community areas, but they're a lot smaller than community areas. So you look at a place like Uptown that like is a relatively diverse neighborhood, and if you just did a community area, that would be flattened a lot. like you'd see that like here are the percentages of like the population, but you wouldn't see where that is. Because I think even within a community area, you can get segregation like block by block. And I think that's information we lose. So I think like, while I don't think we talked about community areas specifically, like we did intentionally not go for something like neighborhood because it would kind of lose a lot of the detail that we were going for.
Thank you. Could any of you talk more about what the school closure data revealed to you, and how they contributed to your interpretation of the maps?
Well, I think one thing we wanted to portray was that the majority of school closures happened in areas that were concentrated Black communities. And so the Black community bore the brunt of more than 50 school closures. So right now, as I think, as we're all having this conversation of how Chicago is losing its Black residents and how there's an out migration, people going back to the South or to other places in the Midwest, I think it's important to understand why people are making these decisions. And I think through interviews, but also with this map and the data that we're finding, I think we realize that one of the factors is that a lot of Black children have lost their neighborhood school, their community school. And when you don't have a stable and well-performing neighborhood school, then that could easily encourage any family to either move to another community or move out of the city altogether. So I think we wanted to show a couple of things that there are a lot of decisions that are being made, not just in politics or legislatively, but even within education and other institutions, right, that are very clearly biased and racist, and that there are effects to that we're still seeing the effects, years and decades later. And if we want to do anything about fixing the segregation or stopping people leaving the city, we have to understand why they're leaving in the first place. So I think the map just really shows how blatant or intentional the school closures were, and how the Black community has suffered.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess maybe on that note as well, maybe kind of next step from that related question of how do we get this data into the hands of policymakers and convince them to use data like this to make more data-driven decisions that benefit their communities?
I guess maybe this is taking in a different direction. But I think in some cases we talk about using data to make decisions, assuming good faith. And frankly, like CPS had census information. They knew specific to schools who was attending what school. And I think it's just worth considering here that like they have this information and they either choose to ignore it, choose to find ways to explain around it, find other ways of justifying a school closure. And yet I think when you present something like this, it does become really apparent that like this has been a like multi-decade, multi-century endeavor like this. It didn't start recently. And so while we can kind of talk about ways to like make some of this information more accessible, I think it's hard to say that they didn't have access, especially given that this is just straight census population data and the city would have access to things that are more granular than this. So yeah, sometimes I think it's just worth questioning, like, is it that they didn't have the data, or that they chose to interpret it in a different way or ignore it altogether.
Very good point. I think we have time for at least one more question, maybe two. Can you say a little bit more about what your main sources of data were besides the census data, like for housing or school data? And can you describe like the difficulty in getting that data?
Pat already mentioned this, but I will sort of underscore it, is that sometimes data collection takes a longer time than or it feels like it takes a longer time than building the thing. One of the editors on the project, Jim Daly, manually collected addresses of Chicago Housing Authority, like public housing units, and put that into a spreadsheet. I believe geocoded it, or like looked up the latitude and longitude, and then handed that spreadsheet to Pat. So that took a while. I'm not sure how Jim found those addresses beyond just like your regular journalistic research. I think the school closures came from, was it the Chicago Reporter that had all those addresses? Yeah, so the Chicago Reporter created a map. I believe it was like the year that all this, or like in the year that most of the schools closed, with locations. And so we just sort of scraped that data from their story. And then highways, that is just a shapefile, I believe. That is, I think, City of Chicago data portal. You can find that. And redlining. How did we get those again, Pat?
There's a research center that's doing some really great work, both like taking the original maps and then converting them to like you can see here, we don't have a bunch of like images. You actually do get the shapes. So they've done some really great work doing that. I think if you Google like American Panorama, I think it's out of a research center at like the University of Virginia. If you Google for redlining maps, usually it'll come up, and they have really easy access to download the data, like totally or just for specific areas.
Great, thank you so much. I think that puts us right at time here. So thank you again so much, Jackie, Charmaine, and Pat for joining us this evening and telling us about their mapping project.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for taking interest in what we do.
I know this was a great presentation. So we do have our post-presentation live stream. Yes. So that will be dropped into the chat. And again, the code of conduct applies. Otherwise, I think that about wraps it up for our presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And as always, go forth
And hack.
Woo.
Thanks, everyone.